Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means the world. The unseen bond. That morning, the alarm blared earlier than usual, but Amelia was already awake. In fact, she'd barely slept. Little Leo, just 8 months old, had spent a restless night, crying for no apparent reason. She had rocked him in her arms until he finally drifted off. But by the time silence finally enveloped their small apartment, it was almost time to get up. With deep circles under her eyes and an exhausted body, Amelia prepared his bottle while checking her phone. Her heart pounded when she saw the message from the babysitter. "So sorry, but I won't be able to watch Leo today. Something unexpected came up." Her breath caught in her throat. There was no one who could help her at such short notice. She looked at her son, who was playing with an old toy on the rug, oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. Her job at Sterling Corp, one of the biggest companies in the city, was her only source of income. If she missed work without notice, she could be fired. If she were fired, she wouldn't have money for rent. And if she didn't pay rent, she preferred not to finish the thought. A tremor ran through her body as she made the only possible decision. She would have to take Leo to work. She dressed quickly, choosing her cleaner's uniform, which allowed her to go unnoticed in the company's luxurious hallways. She grabbed the baby's bag, packed some diapers, a bottle, and a blanket. "You have to be good, my love," she whispered to her son, though she knew it was impossible to predict how a baby would react in a strange environment. On the bus ride to the financial district, where Sterling Corp's imposing skyscraper stood, Amelia felt her heart pound. Bringing children to work was strictly forbidden. If she were caught, there would be no forgiveness. As soon as she arrived at the building, she wrapped Leo in a blanket and held him tightly against her chest, hiding him as best she could. She passed reception without raising suspicion, simply offering a shy smile to the security guard, who already knew her by sight. She walked quickly through the hallways, trying not to draw attention, until she reached the small storage room where the cleaning supplies were kept. As soon as she closed the door behind her, she let out a sigh of relief. For now, she was safe. Leo began to murmur, and she quickly picked him up, rocking him gently so he wouldn't cry. Everything would be fine. She just needed to go unnoticed during the morning shift. But she didn't know that, in a few hours, her destiny would cross paths with that of the most powerful man in that building, and her life would never be the same. Amelia remained hidden in the small storage room for as long as she could, trying to balance work with caring for Leo. With each new whimper from the baby, her heart raced with fear of being discovered. She just needed to finish the morning shift without drawing attention. But as fate seemed to enjoy playing with her life, things wouldn't be so simple. When the clock struck 9 a.m., an urgent call came over the internal radio. One of the meeting rooms needed to be disinfected before the CEO arrived. Fear ran down her spine. CEO Richard Vance was a man known as much for his coldness as for his intolerance for any mistakes. Amelia had no choice. She adjusted Leo in the sling she wore over her uniform and left the storage room, walking down the long marble hallway that reflected the company's grandeur. If she kept her head down and was quick, no one would notice. She entered the meeting room and began to clean in silence, hoping Leo would remain asleep. But, as if sensing his mother's tension, the baby began to stir and murmur. "Shh, my love, just a little longer," she whispered as she wiped the glass table. It was at that moment that disaster struck. The door burst open, and a deep, authoritative voice echoed through the room. "What on earth is going on here?" Amelia spun around immediately, feeling the blood drain from her face. There, in front of her, stood Richard Vance. Tall, imposing, impeccably dressed in a gray suit that highlighted his aristocratic features. dark eyes, cold as ice, fell on her, and then on the baby strapped to her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. The executives accompanying Richard stopped at the door, watching the scene as if Amelia were an intruder in forbidden territory. "You brought a baby into my office." The disbelief and contempt in Richard's voice made Amelia feel tiny. She tried to speak, to explain, but her throat was dry. "Sir, I had no choice." "No choice?" He laughed, but without humor. "This is an office, not a daycare. If you can't separate your personal life from work, this might not be the right place for you." Amelia felt her face burn with humiliation. Leo, sensing his mother's distress, began to cry, and Richard's face twisted in pure disgust. "Get this child out of here before I act." The words were as sharp as razors. Amelia hugged Leo against her chest, her eyes filled with tears that refused to fall. She desperately needed that job, but faced with Richard's icy gaze and the murmurs of the surrounding executives, she felt defenseless. She didn't respond. She simply lowered her head, turned, and left the room with the baby in her arms. But as she walked away, something within Richard stirred uncomfortably, as if, for a second, he had seen something in that woman that reminded him of a past he had sworn never to touch again. Amelia left the meeting room with a heavy heart, feeling the weight of their gazes on her. Her face burned with shame, but she couldn't afford to break down there. She needed to be strong. She walked as fast as she could down the hallway, hugging Leo against her chest, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to escape. When she reached the cleaning storage room, she leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. Leo whimpered softly, sensing his mother's tension. What if Richard fired her? How would she pay the rent? How would she support her son? She closed her eyes and felt despair wash over her. That job was all she had. Before she could collect her thoughts, the storage room door burst open. Patricia, her supervisor, entered with a tense expression. "Amelia, for heaven's sake, what were you thinking?" the woman whispered, looking around to make sure no one was listening. Amelia's voice faltered. "I had no choice. The babysitter canceled at the last minute." Patricia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Do you have any idea who you just faced? Richard Vance is a ruthless man. If he wants to, he can end your professional life with a snap of his fingers." Amelia felt a lump in her throat. "I know," she murmured. Patricia looked at her for a moment, then lowered her voice. "He sent for me. I thought it was your immediate dismissal, but surprisingly, he said nothing. He just asked me to take action." Amelia frowned. "Does that mean I still have the job?" Patricia nodded, but the stern look remained. "For now. But you can't repeat that mistake, Amelia. He won't have patience a second time." Amelia let out a shaky sigh of relief. "Thank you. Thank you for interceding." "For me," Patricia sighed and looked at Leo, who was now sucking his thumb, oblivious to his mother's distress. "You're a good employee. I don't want to lose you, but you need to be more careful. Now go home. Take the rest of the day to sort out your situation with the baby." Amelia nodded quickly and left the building feeling a mix of relief and unease. She still had a job, but for how long? Meanwhile, in the luxurious office on the top floor of Sterling Corp., Richard Vance sat at his desk, drumming his fingers on the glass surface. Why did it bother him so much? He had previously fired employees for less, so why didn't he fire Amelia immediately? He closed his eyes, and against his will, he remembered the scene. The slender woman, dressed in a simple uniform, holding her child with such desperation and tenderness at the same time. The image triggered something inside him that he preferred to keep buried. Richard let out a sigh of exasperation and picked up a glass of whiskey, slowly swirling the amber liquid. "This has nothing to do with me," he murmured to himself, trying to dispel the discomfort. But something told him this wouldn't be the last encounter between him and Amelia. The next day, Amelia returned to work more cautiously than ever. This time, Leo stayed with the neighbor, a kind elderly woman who offered to help. But the young mother's worry didn't lessen. What if Richard changed his mind and decided to fire her? What if Patricia couldn't protect her once more? Keeping her head down, Amelia focused on her tasks. She had to be invisible, but unfortunately for her, that was far from happening. Richard Vance saw her. From his glass office, the magnate observed the company's activity as he did every morning. His eyes, however, stopped on a single person. The woman he should have forgotten. There was Amelia, cleaning one of the hallways with a tired but determined expression. This time without the baby. He should have ignored her, but he couldn't. Instead, he felt irritated. Why did that scene bother him so much? The CEO frowned and walked away from the window. He poured himself some coffee, trying to ignore his unease. But when he closed his eyes for a brief second, the memories came back with brutal force. 5 years earlier, the scent of lavender still permeated the sheets when Richard woke up. The smile of Clara, his wife, was the first thing he saw that morning. "Shall we have coffee together today?" she asked, as she placed little Daniel in his arms. Richard leaned in to kiss the baby's forehead, feeling a love he was only just beginning to understand. "Of course," he replied, smiling. He never would have imagined that would be the last time he saw them both alive. Hours later, a call, an accident, a truck out of control, no survivors. The breakfast he had promised never happened. Instead, Richard spent the next few days at the bottom of a whiskey bottle, refusing to accept reality. Love had destroyed him. Since then, he had never allowed himself to feel anything again. But then, the cleaner appeared, bringing a baby with her. And now, against his will, he couldn't get them out of his head. Richard took a deep breath and poured the coffee down the sink. It meant nothing. He wouldn't let the past haunt him again, much less because of an insignificant employee. And yet, when he looked towards the hallway, his eyes searched for her again. Amelia was cleaning the floor of the main lobby when she felt her phone vibrate in her apron pocket. Her heart froze when she saw the neighbor's name on the screen. "Mrs. Davies, what happened?" "Amelia, dear, Leo has a fever. He won't stop crying, and he's so hot. I don't know what to do." The young mother felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "I'm coming now," she said, quickly hanging up. But before she could take a step, a deep, authoritative voice echoed behind her. "Where do you think you're going?" Amelia turned and found Richard Vance standing there, arms crossed, looking impatient. He had been watching her for days, as if trying to understand something he couldn't explain himself. My son is sick. I have to go." The magnate frowned. "In the middle of the day?" Amelia felt tears burn in her eyes, but she couldn't afford to cry. She needed to get out of there. "Now, I know it's against the rules, sir, but please, I can't leave him like this." Richard was silent for a moment, his gaze studying the woman in front of him. She was trembling, not from fear of him, but from pure desperation. And before he could stop himself, he made a decision. "Come with me." "What?" Amelia blinked, confused. "I said, come with me. Now." Without further explanation, Richard began to walk towards the exit. Amelia hesitated for only a second before running after him. She had no idea what was happening. They got into a car. The silence inside the vehicle was suffocating. Richard drove steadily, his gaze fixed on the road, while Amelia clasped her hands in her lap, uneasy. What was happening? "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. He didn't answer immediately. He just gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I don't know." The answer took her by surprise. Before she could press him, they arrived at the neighbor's building. Amelia rushed out, taking the steps 2 at a time. When she opened the door, her heart almost stopped. Leo was lying on the sofa, his face red, his little body sweaty and fragile. "My love, Mommy's here." She took him in her arms, trying to contain her panic. Behind her, Richard entered the apartment. "He needs a doctor now," he said without hesitation. "I know, but I don't have—" Amelia swallowed. "Money." Richard simply picked up his phone and called a doctor friend. "Let's go to the car. Let's go to the hospital." Amelia felt tears well up, this time unable to hold them back. Why was he doing this? The doctor quickly examined Leo and diagnosed a common virus, but one that required hydration and rest. Amelia finally let out a sigh of relief, kissing her son's face. When she left the office, she found Richard waiting in the hallway. He was there, still there. He had no obligation, but he stayed. "Thank you," she said, emotional. Richard looked away, uncomfortable. He didn't know why he did that, but one thing was certain. For the first time in years, he had cared about someone, and that scared him more than anything else. The days that followed were different. Something had changed. Amelia felt it in the air, in the furtive glances Richard cast as he passed through the company's hallways. He looked at her, but not with contempt or impatience as before. It was something deeper, more intense. She tried to ignore it. She tried to convince herself that it meant nothing. He was a millionaire, a man who would never look at a woman like her. And yet, he was the one who helped her when she needed it most. In his office, Richard couldn't concentrate. Sitting in his luxurious leather armchair, he reviewed important contracts, but his mind insisted on wandering in another direction. To her, Amelia. Her name no longer sounded strange in his thoughts. Since that day at the hospital, something inside him hadn't returned to normal. He found himself remembering the way she hugged her son, how her eyes overflowed with love and desperation at the same time. She was different. In that company, he saw everyone bowing to his presence. He saw ambition, falsehood, fear. But Amelia, she asked for nothing. She just fought. Every day. And that bothered him. Do you think Richard will ever fully open up about his past? Share your predictions in the comments. In the evening shift, Amelia was finishing cleaning the executive floor hallway when she heard firm footsteps approaching. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. "Still here?" Richard's deep voice made her shiver. Since when did he talk to her? "Yes, sir. I still have one last room to clean." He crossed his arms and studied her for a moment. "And Leo?" She blinked, surprised. "He's better. Thank you for asking, Marlins. Do you always do everything yourself?" His question came without warning, full of genuine curiosity. Amelia took a deep breath. "Yes, I always have." Richard was silent for a moment, as if processing that information. Then, without saying anything else, he simply nodded and continued on his way. But Amelia remained there, paralyzed, feeling her heart pound. He was trying to understand her, and for the first time she realized something she never would have imagined. Richard Vance was not as impenetrable as he seemed. The next day, Amelia arrived at work, determined to remain invisible. Richard Vance had already interfered too much in her life, and she couldn't afford to get her hopes up. He was a powerful man, used to getting what he wanted, and she didn't want to be another fleeting whim. But contrary to what she expected, he didn't ignore her. At the end of the day, as she was putting away the cleaning products, one of Richard's assistants appeared. "Mr. Vance wants to speak with you, now." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. That couldn't be good. Entering the office, she found Richard standing by the enormous glass window, his back to her. The city view stretched out before him as if he owned everything. He turned slowly, analyzing her, with that gaze that always destabilized her. "Amelia," she heard nervously. "I've been thinking," he began, crossing his arms, "about yesterday's situation, about your son." Amelia swallowed. "No need to worry, sir. I won't bring Leo to work again." But Richard raised an eyebrow. "That's not what concerns me." She frowned, confused. "Then what?" He leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the table. "I want you to work closer to me." Amelia blinked. "Excuse me, sir?" Richard sighed, as if he had to explain something obvious. "I want you to work directly for me." Silence filled the room like a bomb about to explode. But why? The question escaped her before she could hold it back. Richard narrowed his eyes. "Because I need someone reliable to take care of my work environment." Amelia felt her heart race. That made no sense. "But I'm a cleaner." "And now you'll be my personal assistant," he interrupted. Amelia didn't know what to say. It was a proposal too good to be true. A better salary meant stability for Leo. But what was the real reason behind Richard's offer? She took a deep breath. She needed the money. "If it means a better salary, then I'll accept." Richard nodded slowly. "Excellent. We start tomorrow, Dart." And as she left the office, she didn't notice the small smile of satisfaction that formed on his lips. The next morning, Amelia entered the executive floor, feeling out of place. The curious, even envious, glances from other employees made her uncomfortable. Everyone wanted to know how a simple cleaner had become the personal assistant to the most powerful man at Sterling Corp. She herself still didn't know the answer. "Think about the money. Think about Leo," she murmured to herself before entering Richard's office. He was already there, impeccably dressed, as always. He was an intimidating man, but for the first time, Amelia saw something beyond his coldness. Tiredness. Richard Vance seemed exhausted, and she didn't know why. "Good morning, sir." He looked at her, and for a moment just observed her. "Amelia," she heard nervously, expecting some difficult order or impossible task. But instead, he analyzed her as if trying to decipher her. "Why did you accept this job?" he asked suddenly. Amelia blinked. "Because I need the money." Richard gave a dry, direct, and blunt smile. "I like that." Amelia didn't respond. That conversation confused her. "And your son, how is he?" She frowned. "Better, thank you." Richard simply nodded, looking away. Why did he ask about Leo? The rest of the day continued with precise instructions and formal interactions. But Amelia began to notice something strange. He looked at her. Sometimes, she caught Richard staring at her, as if trying to understand something about her that made no sense to him. And when their eyes met, he quickly looked away. Richard was already fighting an internal battle. He had never allowed anyone to affect him. But Amelia, there was something about her that disarmed him. The way she protected her son, the silent strength she carried, the way she looked him in the eye without fear. He didn't want to feel anything, but he felt it, and that infuriated him. At the end of the afternoon, while reviewing some documents, Richard called Amelia to his desk. "Read this to me." She took the sheet and began to read it aloud. But when she realized Richard was looking at her intensely, her voice broke. "What is it?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Amelia swallowed. "You're looking at me strangely." Richard leaned slightly forward. "And in what way would that be?" She hesitated. Why did the air feel heavier? "As if you were trying to understand me." He remained silent for a moment, and then murmured something that left Amelia breathless. Perhaps that's exactly what I'm doing. Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, Richard abruptly stood up. The meeting starts in 5 minutes. You're dismissed. Amelia left the room with her heart racing, not understanding what had just happened. But one thing was certain. The relationship between them was changing, and Richard hated every second of it. Days passed, and Amelia noticed that Richard was becoming increasingly unpredictable. Sometimes distant and cold, sometimes attentive and protective. She felt the tension growing between them, but tried to ignore it. After all, he was her boss. But that night, everything changed. It was late. Most employees had already left, but Amelia was still in the office organizing some documents. Leo was with Mrs. Davies, and for the first time, she didn't have to rush home immediately. Richard was still there too. Amelia knew because she could hear him walking in the office next door, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Since she started working with him, she had never seen him leave early. Thunder rumbled in the sky, and rain began to fall heavily against the enormous glass windows. The sound was almost mesmerizing. Amelia hesitated, but before she could stop herself, she knocked on his office door. "Come in." She opened the door slowly. Richard was sitting behind the desk, elbows resting on the glass top, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. But what caught her attention most was the whiskey bottle next to him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. He looked at her and let out a dry laugh. "That's a dangerous question, Amelia." She frowned. "Why?" Richard picked up the glass of whiskey and slowly swirled the amber liquid. Then, as if he could no longer contain what was trapped inside him, he said, "Because if I answer you honestly, you'll see a side of me that no one else sees." Amelia felt a shiver run down her skin. He no longer wore the mask of the ruthless CEO. At that moment, in front of her, there was only a man, wounded. Richard took a deep breath and turned his gaze to the city illuminated by the rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and hoarser. "I already had a family, Amelia." She held her breath. "A wife, a son." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to push away the pain. But when he looked at her again, there was something there. A deep shadow. "They died 5 years ago." Amelia put a hand to her mouth. "My God!" "An accident. A damn truck out of control." He let out a shaky sigh. "I was at work when I got the call. I never saw them alive again." That confession broke something inside Amelia. Now everything made sense. The coldness, the distance, the gaze always filled with something no one could define. Richard Vance was not a man without feelings. He was a man who buried them with his family. She approached hesitantly. "Richard, I'm so sorry." He looked away and clenched his jaw. "You don't need to feel anything. The pain is mine, and I've learned to live with it." Amelia hesitated for a second, and then, before she could help it, she reached out and lightly touched his hand on the table. Richard remained motionless. It was the first time in years that someone had touched him like that, tenderly, with understanding, without pity. He didn't pull his hand away, and in that instant, something silent and powerful formed between them. A bond, something that not even pain could destroy. The days that followed were different. There was something new between Amelia and Richard, a silent complicity, a mutual understanding that they didn't need to verbalize. And then came the moment that would change everything. It was a Saturday afternoon when Richard made an impulsive decision. He wanted to see Leo. He didn't know why. He just knew he couldn't get the baby out of his head, the one who slept peacefully on his mother's chest that night at the hospital. He had never sought out children since he lost Daniel. But something inexplicably drew him to Leo. When he arrived at the simple building where Amelia lived, He wondered if this was crazy. There he was now, Richard Vance, a man who never got involved. Amelia opened the door, surprised. "Richard? What are you doing here?" She hesitated for a second, but then she saw Leo on the living room rug, playing with a teddy bear. The baby's wide, innocent eyes met his, and then Leo smiled. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. That smile was like a ray of sunshine breaking through a storm. "I thought I might bring him something," he murmured, holding a small box with an expensive toy. Amelia looked at him, surprised, but made room for him to enter. She knew how much that meant. Richard knelt down and held out the toy. Leo, without hesitation, crawled towards him, laughing softly, without fear, without barriers. And then he did something Richard didn't expect. He raised his little arms, asking to be held. Richard's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. But before he could rationalize, he was already taking Leo in his arms. And the world seemed to stop. He felt the warmth of his small body against his chest. The soft baby scent. The feeling was so familiar, it hurt. And for the first time in years, he felt something break inside him. Something he thought was dead. The desire to have a family again. The night was silent in the Sterling Corp office. Most employees had already left, but Richard was still there. And Amelia, too. Since the day he held Leo in his arms, something had changed. He could no longer maintain the same distance, and Amelia felt that. She saw him looking at her when he thought no one noticed. She saw how he softened, even for brief moments, when he spoke to her. It was as if he was fighting something within himself. And that night, Richard couldn't fight anymore. Amelia entered the room with a folder of documents, but she stopped when she saw him. Richard was sitting on the dark leather sofa, elbows resting on his knees, gaze lowered, thoughts distant. He didn't even notice her presence immediately. "Mr. Vance?" He looked up slowly. There was something different about him. "Have you finished your tasks?" he asked, but his voice wasn't as firm as usual. "Yes, I just came to drop off these papers." Richard looked at the folder on the table, but didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he let out a long sigh. "You know what's funny, Amelia?" She frowned. "What?" He leaned his head back against the sofa and closed his eyes for a moment. "I spent years believing I could live without feeling anything." Amelia felt a shiver run down her body. Where was he going with this? "I closed all the doors, to pain, to joy, to anything that would remind me I'm still human." He laughed softly, but without humor. "And then you appeared." Amelia held her breath. Richard opened his eyes and looked at her. His gaze was intense, filled with something she couldn't decipher. And suddenly, everything I tried to bury started to come back. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to respond. She wanted to say she understood, that he no longer needed to hide. But she didn't have time. Suddenly, Richard stood up and ran his hands through his hair. "That was a mistake." "What?" she asked, confused. He turned to her, and now his gaze was different. There was something dark there, something that seemed to want to push her away. I can't feel this." Amelia felt a tightness in her chest. "Richard, this has to stop." He looked away, his fists clenched. "Tomorrow, everything goes back to normal." And without further explanation, he picked up his jacket and left the room, leaving Amelia alone. But she knew nothing would ever go back to normal. The next day was a silent battle. Richard remained distant. Amelia noticed this from the moment she arrived at the office. No furtive glances, no questions about Leo, none of the almost palpable tension that had grown between them. It was as if Richard had locked himself away again, raising the barriers that, for a brief moment, had fallen. But she knew it was a lie. He wanted to push her away, but he couldn't stop what was already happening. And that night, everything would come to a head. The rain fell heavily as Amelia left the Sterling Corp building. The shift was over, but she couldn't leave. The conversation from the previous night still echoed in her mind. She walked through the parking lot, huddled in her thin coat. The cold was biting, but nothing compared to what she felt inside. Then she heard footsteps. She turned and saw him. Richard. Wet. Eternal. A man in conflict with himself. He said nothing. He just stood there, looking down at her. The rain, his dark hair dripping, his chest rising and falling, as if he were fighting something bigger than himself. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I tried, Amelia." He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he hated every word. "I tried to forget. I tried to ignore it. But I can't." Amelia felt her heart race. "Richard, no." But before she could finish the sentence, he crossed the distance between them and took her face in both hands. His dark eyes were filled with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "I shouldn't do this," he murmured, his voice hoarse, full of hesitation. And then he kissed her. It was a strong, urgent kiss, as if he were drowning, and Amelia was the only one who could save him. The rain fell around them, but nothing else existed at that moment. Amelia responded because her body already knew the answer before her mind could even formulate one. But then he pulled away. Richard's eyes were full of conflict. This shouldn't have happened." Amelia felt the impact of those words like a blow to the chest. Did he regret it? Or was he simply too scared to admit how he felt? These were questions she had no answer to. But one thing was certain. Richard Vance was falling in love, and that terrified him. The next day dawned heavy. Amelia arrived at work with a tightness in her chest, knowing that something had changed. And it wasn't just within her. Richard wasn't at the company that morning, unusual for a man who never allowed himself absences. She knew the reason. He was running away. The kiss from the previous night still burned on her lips, but Richard's expression after that moment was etched in her mind. Regret. She tried to convince herself that she didn't care, but she did care. After all, she felt something for him, and that something scared her as much as it seemed to scare him. Richard returned to the company late in the afternoon. He didn't speak to Amelia. He remained locked in his office, immersed in work, ignoring everything that wasn't urgent. But the truth was, he couldn't get Amelia out of his head. Her touch, the taste of her lips, the warmth of her body next to his. He cursed under his breath, frustrated with himself. He should never have allowed that to happen. But then, why did he want it to happen again so badly? When Amelia finally decided to confront him, she knocked on his office door. "Come in." His voice sounded distant, cold, different. She entered and saw Richard glancing through papers, not even looking at her. "We need to talk." He finally looked up. There was something different about his eyes, a calculated distance. "There's nothing to talk about, Amelia," he said firmly. What happened was a mistake." She felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. "A mistake?" she repeated, swallowing with difficulty. Richard held her gaze. "Yes, a mistake." Her heart sank. Why did that hurt so much? What did she expect? That he would admit he felt something. She laughed without humor. "It's clear. You're Richard Vance, the untouchable CEO. I was just a distraction." Richard frowned. "Amelia, don't worry. I understood perfectly." She interrupted him. She wouldn't let him humiliate her anymore. Before he could say anything else, Amelia left the room, feeling tears burning in her eyes. Richard remained there, looking at the closed door, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Pain. He wanted to chase her, to tell her it wasn't a mistake, that she was right, that he was terrified of what he felt. But he did nothing, because pride still spoke louder. The next morning, Amelia arrived at work, determined to move on. If Richard Vance wanted distance, that's exactly what he would get. She would do her job. She would keep her head held high. And, most importantly, she would treat him as if nothing had happened. But what she didn't expect was that this irritated him greatly. Richard watched Amelia from his desk as she organized some documents. She didn't look at him. No smile. No exchange of furtive glances. It was as if he didn't exist, and that infuriated him. He tried to tell himself it was better this way. He wanted her to avoid him, right? So why did he feel this emptiness in his chest? "Amelia," he called, testing if she would still react to his voice. She raised her head and responded with as much indifference as possible. "Yes, Mr. Vance." His blood boiled. Mr. Vance? Before, she called him Richard. Now it seemed as if he were just another boss. He cleared his throat and crossed his arms. "I need you to review the meeting report for tomorrow." "Yes, sir." And then she went back to work, without hesitation, without looking back at him. Richard felt a bitter taste in his mouth. That's what he wanted, wasn't it? That afternoon he tested her in every possible way. He called her more times than necessary. He asked for detailed reports. Deadlines changed at the last minute. Any excuse to see her react. But Amelia remained impassive. Polite. Professional. Distant. And Richard realized with a pang of frustration that he was losing control. When the clock struck 6 in the afternoon, Amelia grabbed her bag and prepared to leave. But before she could cross the door, Richard said, "So, this is how it is now?" She stopped, but she didn't turn around. "What do you mean, sir?" "Vance?" He stood up and slowly approached. The air around him felt heavy. "You're avoiding me." She let out a dry laugh. "No, sir. I'm just doing my job." Richard clenched his fists. "If you think your indifference affects me in any way." Amelia finally turned around, her eyes shining. "Affects you? Excellent. Because now you know exactly how I felt when you told me everything was a mistake." Silence. Richard opened his mouth, but couldn't formulate a response, because she was right. And then, without waiting for him to say anything else, Amelia simply left the room. Richard stood there, alone, feeling frustration grow inside him. He wanted distance, but now that he had it, he realized he couldn't stand it. The relationship between Richard and Amelia had reached an impasse. He could no longer ignore her, but he also didn't know how to approach her without admitting how he truly felt. And she, in turn, refused to be someone disposable in his life. But fate, always unpredictable, was about to test this connection in an unexpected way. That afternoon, a figure from Richard's past appeared at the Sterling Corp door. Isabella Thorne. Tall, elegant, with a poisonous smile and a gaze that had already broken many hearts. She was the woman he believed years ago would be Richard's wife. But then Clara, his late wife, came onto the scene and changed everything. Isabella never forgave Richard for leaving her. And even after the tragedy that left him a widower, she knew he would never be the same. And now, she was back. Amelia was leaving the meeting room when she saw Isabella enter Richard's office, as if she still belonged there. She stopped, hesitating, not knowing whether to leave or pretend she hadn't seen anything. But then, she heard Isabella's voice. "Richard, it's been too long." Amelia hid behind the wall. She shouldn't have listened to that conversation, but something inside her prevented her from leaving. Richard sighed deeply. "What are you doing here, Isabella?" She smiled, sitting in the armchair in front of him. "I missed you." He laughed without humor. "Don't lie to me. Say what you want immediately." Isabella leaned forward. Her eyes gleamed with a dangerous challenge. "I heard you've been different lately." She twirled the ring on her finger thoughtfully. "More human." Richard frowned. "And what does this have to do with you?" Her smile disappeared. "I know you, Richard. I know what happened to you." He remained silent. Isabella stood up and walked towards him, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You can pretend to care, pretend you feel something again, but in the end, you always return to the darkness." Richard pulled away sharply. "Are you done?" Isabella laughed, but this time with a touch of cruelty. "I'm just reminding you of what you already know. You can never love again." Amelia felt her body freeze. Every word from Isabella hit her like a direct blow to her heart. Could Richard really not love anyone else? Did that mean everything she felt had no future? She swallowed and walked away before he saw her there. It was better to convince herself now. Before it was too late, Richard Vance would never open up to love. And if she stayed there, she would be another one who would get hurt. Amelia spent the night awake. Isabella's words echoed in her mind like a cruel warning. You can never love again. She wanted to believe it wasn't true, that Richard could change, that perhaps deep down he was already changing. But she couldn't fool herself. He never said anything, never promised anything, and she couldn't continue living with this uncertainty. The next morning, while having coffee at her apartment table, she received an unexpected email. It was from an old coworker, a job offer at a smaller but stable company in another city. The salary was good enough to guarantee a more peaceful future for Leo, and most importantly, far from Richard Vance. She looked at her son, who was playing with one of his worn toys on the living room rug. Was this her destiny, to leave before it was too late? Hours later, she was already in Patricia's office, her supervisor, with a resignation letter in hand. "Are you sure about this, Amelia?" Patricia asked, surprised. "Is this change permanent?" Amelia nodded decisively. "Yes, it's the best option for Leo and for me, and Richard already knows?" Amelia felt a tightness in her chest. "Not yet, but I don't think he'll care." Patricia looked at her for a moment, as if seeing beyond her words. "If you think that, then you've never truly known Richard." But Amelia didn't want to think about it, couldn't think about it. She handed in her resignation letter and left the room with firm steps. She had made her choice. The problem was, Richard Vance didn't know it yet, and when he found out, fate would play its last hand. Richard Vance was never a man who accepted loss. He conquered. He dominated. He kept everything under control. But for the first time in his life, he felt as if something was slipping through his fingers. And that something had a name. Amelia. He was reviewing documents in his office when he received a notification, a copy of Amelia's resignation. He read the message once, then again, and once more. But the words remained the same. Amelia Reed has submitted her resignation and will cease her activities at Sterling Corp. in 2 days. Richard felt a tightness in his chest, like he had never felt before. She was leaving, definitively. He stood up abruptly, making his chair slide backward. "This can't be happening." In recent days, he had avoided Amelia. He tried to bury what he felt. But now that she was leaving, everything became absurdly clear. He couldn't live without her. Neither could Leo. The idea hit him like a punch. He wanted them, both of them, in his life. But what if it was too late? Without thinking, Richard left his room, striding down the hallway. He needed to find her. He needed to stop this. But when he reached the administrative sector, Patricia, Amelia's supervisor, intercepted him. "She's not here, Mr. Vance." He turned to her, his eyes filled with urgency. "Where is she?" Patricia hesitated. "She already went home. She's organizing everything to move." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. The fear he had never felt in his life completely overwhelmed him. If he didn't do something now, he would lose Amelia forever, and that was something he couldn't allow. Richard grabbed his car keys and left the building without looking back. He would go to her, and this time he wouldn't let his pride get in the way, because he knew deep down in his soul that if Amelia left, she would take with her the only chance he had to be happy again. The morning was gray, heavy, as if the sky itself felt the weight of the moment. Amelia was at the bus terminal, holding Leo in her lap, while her suitcase stood beside her. The ticket was already bought. In less than an hour, she and her son would be in another city, far from Richard. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that this was right, something inside her hurt. She loved him, but loving a man who couldn't reciprocate that love was constant suffering. She sighed, kissing Leo's forehead. "It'll be better this way, my love. Mommy promises." But deep down, even she wasn't sure. A few blocks away, Richard drove like a madman. He had never been so scared before, but the idea of arriving too late terrified him. "Wait for me, Amelia." He sped up even more. "Passengers bound for Riverbend, please proceed to boarding." Amelia took a deep breath. It was the final call. She bent down to pick up her suitcase and prepared to walk to the platform. But suddenly she heard a loud noise, the sound of tires screeching on the asphalt. Everyone in the terminal turned to look, and that's when she saw him. Richard got out of the car, almost stumbling, his hair disheveled, his breathing already ragged, his eyes filled with something Amelia had never seen before. Desperation. He found her in the crowd, and, without hesitation, went towards her. "Amelia!" His voice echoed through the terminal, loud enough for everyone to hear. She froze. "What are you doing here?" Richard stopped right in front of her, his chest heaving, his eyes burning into hers, and then, without warning, he took her face in his hands. "You can't leave." She felt her heart race. "Richard, no. No, you'll listen to me now." He took a deep breath, and then, in front of everyone, said the words that would change everything. "I love you." The terminal was silent. Amelia felt the world stop. "I know I'm an idiot. I know I hurt you. But I can't deny it anymore, Amelia." His dark eyes were filled with truth. "I love you." His voice broke a little, but he continued. "And I love Leo too. I want both of you in my life. I want us to be a family." Tears filled Amelia's eyes. "Richard, are you sure?" He took Leo and looked into the baby's eyes. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." Leo touched his face with his tiny hands, as if confirming that's where he should be. Amelia smiled through tears. "Then I'm staying." Richard let out a shaky sigh, and without waiting for anything else, kissed her there, in front of everyone. And in that moment, he knew he would never let her go again. Richard's kiss carried urgency, desperation, and promise, but Amelia still felt afraid. When he pulled away, her eyes were tearful. "You say you love me now, Richard, but what about tomorrow? What about when you realize I'm not like the women in your world?" Richard took her face in both hands, his dark eyes pleading for trust. "You are exactly the woman I want, the only one." Amelia looked away, hugging Leo against her chest. She wanted to believe. God, how she wanted to. But the fear of disappointment was still too great. "And Leo?" Her voice was hesitant. "You say you want us, but he's not your son. Are you ready to be a father to him? To take on that responsibility forever? The silence that followed was thick, and Richard realized that this was the last barrier between them. It was the moment of truth. Without hesitation, he extended his arms. "Let me hold him." Amelia looked at him, surprised, but something in Richard's expression made her trust him. She placed Leo in his arms. Richard held the baby carefully, as if he were the most precious treasure in the world. Leo looked at him with those big, innocent eyes, and then smiled. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. "I'm not the easiest man in the world, Amelia, but if there's one thing I know, it's that I would never do this for the wrong person." He looked at Leo, and then at Amelia. "I want both of you, forever." Amelia covered her mouth with her hands, and tears streamed down her face. "Are you ready to be his father? To love him as if he were your own?" Richard smiled, a sincere smile full of emotion. "He's already mine, Amelia, just like you." And at that moment, all the barriers within Amelia fell. She no longer had doubts. Richard Vance loved her, and most importantly, he loved Leo too. She hugged him tightly, and with tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Then I trust you." Richard closed his eyes and hugged mother and son tightly. He would never let them go again. The days that followed were different. For the first time, Amelia felt no fear. She and Richard began to live as a real family. He was there every morning and every night. Present, not only in words but in gestures, in small things that made a difference. Leo laughed more, and so did Richard. It was as if the man who once lived surrounded by darkness had finally found the light, and that light was them. One afternoon, Richard took her to a large, cozy house with a spacious garden where Leo could play. "What do you think?" he asked, taking her hand. Amelia looked at him, surprised. "It's beautiful, but why are we here?" Richard smiled and kissed her fingers. "Because I want this to be our home, our family home." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure?" Richard held Leo in his lap and looked at her with a gaze full of tenderness. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." Tears welled up in Amelia's eyes, but this time they were happy tears. She wrapped her arms around him, feeling safe, complete, loved. Months later, during a simple dinner at home, Richard picked up a small velvet box and placed it on the table. Amelia's eyes widened. Richard knelt before her and took her hand. "I promised I'd never leave you again, but now I want more than that. I want to be your husband, Amelia. I want to officially be Leo's father." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're already his father, Richard." He smiled. "Then let me be your husband." Amelia laughed through tears and whispered, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." In that moment, they knew they had found everything they needed in each other. Richard, the man who swore never to love again, discovered that love was still possible. Amelia, the woman who never thought she was enough, discovered that she always was. And Leo, the little angel who united their destinies, would have the family he always deserved. Because, in the end, love always wins. Don't forget to leave your opinion on this incredible story in the comments. If you liked it, share it, and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Another story is appearing on your screen, which will probably also move you. Don't miss it.